He said not to tell anyone, that it would be our secret. He said he'd kill me if I opened my mouth. And I, at only 12 years old, believed that monster. The blood on my legs was just the beginning of the nightmare. Good morning, my dear viewers. My name is Clara, but everyone calls me Grandma Clara. I'm 79 years old, born and raised in Bakersfield, California, and today I'm going to share a story I've kept hidden for almost 67 years. A story that many in my family don't fully know, because shame and fear silenced me for so long. If you're watching this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This old lady thanks you from the bottom of her heart. Let me know in the comments which part of the country you're watching from. Sometimes I imagine how my words reach places I've never set foot in, and that gives me a joy I can't even explain. Also, comment something you enjoy doing. I'm looking for new leisure activities to enjoy in my free time. I'm eager to read all your comments. Let's start at the beginning, when I was still the little princess of the house before darkness entered through the front door disguised as family. I was born in 1946, right after World War II. Bakersfield was very different from what it is today. We lived in a large house near downtown with a huge backyard where I played with my cloth dolls. My father, Albert, worked for the railroad company, a respected man who always came home with an impeccable suit even after a full day's work. Mom, Dorothy, was an elementary school teacher, one of those who knew all her students' names by heart. She was an elegant woman, always in a well-pressed dress with her hair done, even at home. She used to say that a proper lady should always look presentable because you never know who might knock on the door. We were a middle-class family at a time when that meant having privileges most didn't have. We had a housekeeper, Sarah, who lived in and took care of everything while my parents worked. She was like a second mother to me, teaching me ghost stories that made me tremble with fear and laugh at the same time. I was an only child, the center of attention. Dad and Mom tried to have more children, but after 2 miscarriages, doctors said it was dangerous for Mom to try again. So all their hopes, dreams, and ambitions were placed on me. And I confess that I took advantage of this position. I was spoiled, yes, I won't deny it. I got the best dolls, the prettiest dresses, and had piano lessons with the Italian teacher who lived near the church. Clara will be an accomplished young lady, Mom would tell the neighbors who came for coffee on Saturday afternoons. She knows how to sew, embroider, and already plays 3 entire songs on the piano. Mornings at school were easy for me. Being the daughter of the most respected teacher in town had its advantages. The other teachers always praised me, even when I didn't deserve it. In the afternoons, after homework, I could play in the yard or on the sidewalk with the other children from the street. We played hopscotch, tops, hide and seek until the sun began to set. Sundays were special. We would wake up early to attend Mass at St. Joseph's Catholic Church. Mom dressed me in my best dress, put ribbons in my hair, and made me promise to stay quiet during the celebration. After Mass, we would have lunch at my maternal grandmother's house, Grandma Elizabeth, who lived a few blocks from the church. Sunday lunch was a feast. Several uncles, aunts, and cousins gathered around the large wooden table in the yard under the shade of an oak tree. Grandma Elizabeth made chicken pot pie that took 2 days to prepare. The smell of that food is one of the most vivid memories I have of my happy childhood. Grandpa William, Grandma Elizabeth's husband, was a quiet but affectionate man. He had worked on the farm since he was a boy, and, even in retirement, still maintained an impeccable vegetable garden in the backyard. It was from him that I received the best fruits: apples, peaches, berries, picked fresh, still warm from the sun. My paternal grandmother, Grandma Ruth, had been a widow since I was a baby. She lived alone in a small house on the other side of town. We visited her once a month, always bringing groceries and medicine. She was a woman of few words, always dressed in black, but who smiled with her eyes when she saw me arrive. It was in 1957, when I was 11 years old, that things began to change. Grandma Elizabeth, the one who made the best chicken pot pie in the world, started feeling intense pain. At first, everyone thought it was just age. She was already 67 at that time. But the pain didn't go away, and she became increasingly thin and weak. "It's a tumor," I heard Dad saying quietly to Mom one night when they thought I was asleep. "The doctor says it has spread throughout her body." I didn't quite understand what that meant, But I knew it was something serious by the way Mom started crying, muffling her sobs with her hands so I wouldn't hear. Grandma Elizabeth lasted only 3 months after the diagnosis. I watched my mother, always so strong and controlled, crumble bit by bit. She started missing work to care for her sick mother. She spent days and nights by her bedside, giving medicine, changing sheets, praying. I remember the day my grandmother passed away. It was a Sunday, ironically. There was no chicken pot pie, no laughter in the yard, just silence and the sound of the adults' contained crying. I sat on the porch step, not really understanding why everyone was so sad, but feeling the weight of that absence that would never be filled again. The funeral was the next day. The whole town seemed to be at the cemetery. Grandma Elizabeth was known and loved by many. Mom was devastated, leaning on my father's arm, looking like she might faint at any moment. It was on that day that I saw my grandpa William, a widow at 70, cry for the first time. Not loud crying, but silent tears that ran down his wrinkled face as he stared at the coffin being lowered into the ground. In the following weeks, life tried to return to normal, but there was a shadow over our house. Mom was different, distant. She tried to smile at me, but I could tell it wasn't the same smile as before. Dad did his best to keep everything running. He took me to and from school, helped Sarah with some household chores, tried to cheer Mom up with small gifts. That's when Grandpa William started showing up more at our house. At first, he came just for Sunday lunch, which was now at our house. Then, he started appearing during the week, too. "Your grandfather is very lonely in that house," Dad explained. "Your mother is the only child who lives in town. All the uncles are far away. It's our responsibility to take care of him now." I liked Grandpa. He always brought peppermint candies in his pocket and told me stories of when he was a boy on the farm. Stories of foxes that appeared in the plantation, of fishing in the river, of 4th of July celebrations where he met my grandmother. They were simple stories, but they made me travel to a time I never knew. One day, about 2 months after Grandma's funeral, my father came home with a serious expression. He called Mom, and they talked quietly in the kitchen for a long time. I tried to listen, but Sarah sent me to my room to do my homework. At dinner that night, Dad made the announcement. "Clara, your grandfather is going to come live with us. He can't stay alone in that house anymore. It's too big for him to take care of, and he's been forgetting things. Yesterday, he left the stove on and could have caused a fire." Mom nodded her head, although her eyes looked worried. "We'll fix up the little room in the back for him. I've already talked to Sarah. She'll help bring his things tomorrow." I was excited about the idea. Having Grandpa at home meant more stories, more peppermint candies, more attention. I didn't notice at that moment how uncomfortable Mom seemed with the situation. I didn't understand the cautious look she and Dad exchanged. How could I imagine that this decision, made out of love and family duty, would completely change the course of my life? How could I know that behind those farm stories and those peppermint candies lurked a monster who would destroy my childhood forever? That night, I slept peacefully, dreaming of the stories Grandpa would tell me every day. Little did I know that the real nightmares were about to begin. Grandpa William arrived on a Wednesday morning, carrying only an old leather suitcase and a cardboard box with his most precious belongings. I was at school when he settled into the little room in the back, the one that was after the laundry area, separated from the main house by a small covered corridor. "Now Grandpa will be part of our routine, Clara," Mom explained while preparing dinner that day. "He's getting old and needs our care. Be a good girl and help where you can, okay?" At first, his presence seemed like a blessing. Grandpa woke up early, even before Sarah, and already had coffee made when everyone got up. He had a simple way of doing things, but efficient. He fixed the faucet that was always dripping, repaired the gate that creaked, started a small garden in the corner of the yard. My father was happy to see that, despite his 70 years, Grandpa still had strength and willingness. "Mr. William has a good hand for these things," Dad commented with approval. "He's a man used to hard work since he was a boy." The first signs that something wasn't right began subtly, like thin clouds announcing a distant storm. I noticed that Mom avoided being alone with Grandpa. When he entered the kitchen while she was cooking, Mom quickly found an excuse to leave or asked me to stay there with her. At that time, I thought it was just the recent grief over Grandma's death that made the atmosphere heavy between them. Grandpa started giving me even more attention. Not only did he tell me stories, but now he brought me small presents. Colorful ribbons for my hair, candies from Mr. Johnson's store, even a cloth doll that he made himself. This delighted me. I had never received so much attention from an adult who seemed to have infinite time for me. It was about a month after his arrival that I noticed the first real change in his behavior. We were having dinner, the four of us, me, Mom, Dad, and Grandpa. Sarah had already retired to her room in the back. My father commented about a raise he had gotten at work. With this extra money, we can even think about enrolling Clara in those ballet classes she's been asking for, Dad said, smiling at me. I almost jumped out of my chair with joy, but Grandpa's voice interrupted my celebration. Ballet, he grumbled, hitting his fork on the plate with more force than necessary. Why waste money on nonsense? Girls need to learn useful things: cooking, sewing, taking care of the house. This business of jumping around in slippers is for city folks who have nothing better to do. An uncomfortable silence took over the table. My father, always so confident, seemed to shrink before Grandpa's harsh words. Mom looked at her plate, avoiding confrontation. Dad, with all due respect, Clara's education is our decision, my father finally replied, but his voice sounded less confident than usual. Grandpa gave a dry laugh. Your decision? You're raising this girl all full of desires. In my day, children obeyed, and that was it. They didn't go around choosing what they wanted to do or not. That was the first time I saw my grandfather's authoritarian side, but it was far from the last. Gradually, he began to interfere in everything. Meal times, the clothes I wore, even the volume of the radio when Dad listened to the baseball game. This house is becoming a mess, he would complain. In my day, a man who respected himself maintained order in the home. It was as if he wanted to own everything, including people. I noticed that Dad, to avoid arguments, began to give in on small things. Mom, in turn, became increasingly quiet, more subdued. The worst was when my father needed to travel for work. It happened once a month. Usually he spent 2 or 3 days away, visiting other railroad stations. On those days, Grandpa acted as if he were the man of the house, giving orders to everyone, including Sarah, who began to complain quietly. Mr. William is not my boss, she murmured to Mom one afternoon when she thought I wasn't listening. The man is acting like he can order even the air we breathe. It was during one of these trips of my father's, in August 1958, that something happened that really scared me for the first time. Mom had gone to take some clothes to a sick cousin and would return only in the late afternoon. Sarah was washing clothes in the back. I was in the living room, doing my math homework. Grandpa entered the living room, sat in the armchair across from me, and watched me in silence. I felt a strange shiver on the back of my neck, as if something wasn't right. Come here, Clara, he said after a few minutes. Let Grandpa see if you're doing that homework right. I approached, holding the notebook. He patted his knee, indicating that I should sit there. Reluctantly, I obeyed. After all, he was my grandfather, and I had always been taught to respect my elders. You're becoming a young lady, he murmured, running his hand through my hair in a way that made me uncomfortable. You're almost at marrying age. Did you know that? I'm only 12, Grandpa, I replied, confused. In my day, a 12-year-old girl was already promised. Your grandmother was 14 when she married me. His hand went down my back in a caress that no longer seemed like a grandfather's caress. You need to learn to be a woman soon. At that moment, Sarah entered the living room carrying a basket of clothes. Grandpa immediately removed his hand from my back and changed his tone of voice. This girl doesn't even know how to do a division. In my day, we learned that with a ruler to the knuckles. I got up quickly, relieved by the interruption. Something in Sarah's look told me she had noticed something strange, because she frowned and kept an eye on me for the rest of the afternoon. At night, after dinner, I went to my room earlier, saying I had a headache. In truth, I wanted to stay away from Grandpa. There was something in the way he looked at me now that made me afraid, a fear I couldn't explain or fully understand. Lying in my bed, I heard my mother and grandfather talking in the kitchen. The voices started low but soon increased. Albert is too soft with that girl, Grandpa's voice echoed down the hall. And so are you. You're raising a useless girl. Dad, please! Mom's voice sounded tired. Clara is a good girl, studious, well-mannered. Well-mannered? He interrupted with a cold laugh. She barely looks at me when I talk to her. In my day, children looked adults in the eye and obeyed without questioning. Times are different, Dad, and I ask you to respect our way of raising our daughter. There was a noise, as if someone had hit the table. Respect? Respect is what you should have for me. I'm your father. After your mother died, you threw me in that back room like I was an old dog. Nobody threw you anywhere, Mom's voice trembled. We're trying to take care of you, give you comfort. Comfort? He laughed again, in that way that gave me chills. You stick me in that cubicle while you stay in the big house? Serve me last at the table? Tell me to shut up when I give advice? There was a silence, and then Mom's voice, now lower. If you're not happy here, you can go back to your house. Nobody forced you to come. Another bang on the table, louder. Is that what you want? To get rid of your old father? Send me back to be alone until I die? Is that how you honor your mother? She must be turning in her grave with shame for you. I covered my ears with the pillow, not wanting to hear any more. That night, I had nightmares with shadows chasing me through the house. The next morning, Mom had deep, dark circles and barely touched her breakfast. Grandpa, on the other hand, seemed strangely satisfied, as if he had won some battle. When Dad returned from his trip 2 days later, I noticed that Mom didn't tell him anything about the argument. She smiled forcedly, said everything was fine. Grandpa, in turn, was more amiable than ever with my father, offering to help with whatever was needed, praising him for working so hard to support the family. It was as if 2 different people lived inside my grandfather, the kind and helpful man who appeared when my father was home, and the controlling tyrant who emerged as soon as Dad walked out the door. A week later, Sarah resigned. She said she had found a better job in a house downtown, but I saw in her eyes that there was another reason. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, "Take care of yourself, child. And if anything bad happens, tell your mother right away." I didn't understand the warning at the time, but soon, very soon, I would perfectly understand what she meant. With Sarah's departure, Mom started staying home more. She took leave from school for a few weeks, saying she needed to organize the house. I think, deep down, she didn't want to leave me alone with Grandpa. This brought me some temporary relief, but it didn't last long. Soon, Mom had to return to classes. The school principal had made it clear he couldn't extend her leave any longer. And Dad started making longer trips, sometimes staying away for an entire week. It was during one of these weeks, in November 1958, that my world completely collapsed. Mom had gone to a meeting at school that would last until late. I was in my room, already in my nightgown, brushing my hair before bed. The door opened without a prior knock. Grandpa was standing there watching me with a look I'll never forget in my life. A look that mixed something animalistic with a calculating coldness that chilled me to the soul. "Your mother won't be back until late," he said, entering the room and closing the door behind him. "We need to have an adult-to-adult talk, Clara." I knew, in that instant, that something terrible was going to happen. A primitive terror took hold of me, making my heart beat so hard it felt like it would explode in my chest. What happened in the following minutes is something that still haunts me on the darkest nights. His rough hands, his weight immobilizing me against the bed, the searing pain, my screams muffled by the wrinkled hand that covered my mouth, the smell of whiskey and sour sweat, the horrible words whispered in my ear. "If you tell anyone, I'll kill you and your mother," he said when he finished, adjusting his clothes as if nothing had happened. "No one will believe you anyway. They'll say you provoked Grandpa, that you're a shameless girl." I remained paralyzed on the bed for a long time after he left, unable to cry, unable even to breathe properly. A piece of me died that night. The confident, happy, and dreamy girl was gone forever, replaced by an empty shell full of shame and fear. The next morning, I couldn't get up to go to school. My body hurt in ways I never imagined possible. There was blood on my nightgown, on the sheets. When Mom came to see why I hadn't gotten up, I lied. I said I had cramps, that I had woken up on those days. She seemed to believe it, brought me tea, and let me stay home. Grandpa spent the whole day out, thank God. When he returned at night, he acted as if nothing had happened. He had dinner normally, told stories to my father, made jokes. He didn't even look in my direction. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell everything. But his words echoed in my head. "I'll kill you and your mother." And I believed it. With the innocence and terror of a 12-year-old child, I believed he was capable of that. So began my personal hell. What should have been a home became a prison of terror. His presence, his smell, his voice, everything caused me panic. And the worst part, nobody noticed. Or maybe they didn't want to notice. The nights became my greatest dread. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, every time a floorboard creaked, I would curl up in bed, praying he wouldn't come. But he always came. Not every night, which was almost worse, because the uncertainty kept me in a constant state of alertness, of anticipated terror. I began to change. I stopped eating properly, lost weight, my grades at school dropped. I no longer wanted to go out to play or talk to anyone. I started sleeping with scissors under my pillow, even knowing I would never have the courage to use them. "What's happening to you, honey?" Mom would ask, concerned. "You look like a ghost walking around." I wanted so badly to tell her. The words would come to the tip of my tongue, but then I would see Grandpa standing at the door, watching me with that look that said everything, and fear silenced me again. 3 months passed like this. 3 months that seemed like 3 centuries. 3 months where each night was torture, each day an exercise in pretending. I had learned to exist in a space between life and death, not completely alive, because something fundamental had been destroyed in me, but also not dead, because my body insisted on continuing to function, breathing, moving automatically through the world. It was in February 1959, at the height of summer, that everything finally came to light. Not because I found the courage to tell. I didn't have that courage. But because my body spoke for me. Grandpa had been particularly violent the night before. Mom and Dad had gone to a birthday party and would only return late. He took advantage to drink more than usual and came to my room earlier than usual. "Today, Grandpa is going to teach you some new things," he said, with that smile that made me nauseous. I tried to resist for the first time. I screamed, kicked, scratched. This only made him more furious. When he finished, I was more injured than usual. Arms bruised from being squeezed so hard, scratches on my shoulders, a cut on my lip from when he hit me to keep me quiet. The next morning, I couldn't hide the injuries. It was summer, it was unbearably hot, and Mom entered the room while I was still sleeping. When she pulled the sheet to wake me up, she saw the bruises on my arms, the dried blood on my cut lip. Her scream woke up the entire house. My mother's scream that hot February morning was like a tear in the fabric of silence that had suffocated me for months. Her eyes scanned my marked body, stopping at each bruise, each scratch, at the cut on my lip. I saw horror growing on her face as the understanding of what was happening finally hit her like lightning. "My God, Clara, who did this to you?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as they approached my bruised arms. I couldn't answer. It was as if a knot had formed in my throat, blocking any words. After months of keeping that horrible secret, I didn't know how to begin, how to make those words come out of my mouth, how to tell my own mother that her father, the man she had welcomed into our home, was destroying my life night after night. Dad appeared at the door, still buttoning his pajama shirt, his hair tousled from having just woken up. "What happened?" he asked, alarmed by the scream. His eyes widened when he saw me. I had never seen my father like that. His face pale, his pupils dilated by shock, his hands closed in fists so tight that the knuckles turned white. For a terrible moment, I thought Grandpa would appear there too. That he would enter the room with that fake, concerned face, pretending to know nothing, ready to invent some lie. My entire body contracted with that possibility. But it was precisely that obvious fear, that physical reaction of terror that finally made my mother understand. I saw the exact moment when perception crossed her face. Her eyes filled with tears, and she covered her mouth with her hand, as if to prevent an even bigger scream from escaping. "It was him, wasn't it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was my father?" I didn't need to answer with words. My silence, the tears that finally began to run down my face, the uncontrollable trembling of my body. Everything confirmed what she feared. My father staggered as if he had been punched in the stomach. He looked at Mom, then at me, then back at her, searching for some explanation that didn't exist, some meaning in a horror that had no meaning at all. "How long?" my mother asked, holding my hands between hers, her eyes fixed on mine. "How long has this been happening, my child?" Three months," I managed to stammer, my voice almost inaudible. "Since November, 3 months. 90 days. For them, it was a shock, a sudden and devastating revelation. For me, it had been an eternity in hell, minute by minute, second by second. My mother's face contorted into an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of pain, anger, and guilt that seemed to age her 10 years in 10 seconds. "Why didn't you tell us before?" my father asked, his voice hoarse. Grandpa's words echoed in my head. "If you tell anyone, I'll kill you and your mother." Even now, with the secret revealed, that threat still had power over me. He said he would kill us if I told," I said between sobs. "He said nobody would believe me, that they would say I provoked him." My father made a strange sound like a wounded animal. I saw something change in his eyes, the confusion and shock giving way to a fury I had never seen in that always calm and controlled man. He abruptly turned and left the room. I heard his heavy footsteps down the hallway, toward the back room. Mom stood up with a jump, suddenly alert. "Albert, no!" she shouted, running after him. I was left alone in bed, still wrapped in the stained sheets, hearing the distant sounds of a commotion, raised voices, something breaking, a dull thud. I wanted to get up, see what was happening, but my body seemed made of lead. I couldn't move a muscle. Minutes later, or were they hours? Time seemed distorted. Mom returned. She was pale, with disheveled hair and eyes red from crying so much. She sat beside me on the bed and hugged me. A hug different from all the others she had ever given me. Desperate, as if she feared I might disappear at any moment. "He's gone," she murmured against my hair. "Your father expelled him. He won't come back, never again. You're safe now." I wanted to believe those words, wanted to feel relieved, liberated. But fear had infiltrated so deeply into me that it seemed to be part of my very skin. "What if he comes back at night?" I asked, my voice choked by the terror that this possibility caused me. "What if he comes to get me when you're sleeping?" Mom held my face between her hands, forcing me to look into her eyes. "It won't happen," she said with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "Your father is out there right now, changing all the locks. And then we'll go to the police." The word police triggered a new wave of panic in me. It meant that other people would know, that I would have to tell everything again, relive every horrible detail. "I don't want to go," I cried, hiding my face in my hands. "I don't want anyone to know." "I understand your fear, my child," Mom said, stroking my hair. "But we need to do this, so that he never hurts you or any other girl again." That day, we didn't go to the police. Instead, Mom took me to the doctor, an old family friend who attended at home with discretion. I remember his face becoming increasingly somber as he examined me, asking questions in a low voice that I could barely answer. "She's going to need care," he told my mother when he finished. "Not just physical." The next morning, still sore and exhausted, I was taken to the police station. It was a gray and intimidating building downtown. Mom held my hand the whole time, while Dad walked a few steps ahead of us, his shoulders tense, his jaw clenched with contained anger. They took us to a small room with peeling walls and a noisy fan that only circulated the hot air. A sheriff with a graying mustache heard our story, noting everything in a worn notebook. His face remained impassive, professional, but I saw something change in his eyes when he understood what had happened. "We need the girl's statement," he said, looking more at my parents than at me. "Alone." "No," I protested, grabbing my mother's arm tightly. "I don't want to be alone." "It's the procedure," the sheriff explained, with surprising gentleness. "But your mother can stay if you prefer." So, with Mom by my side, I told everything. Each night, each abuse, each threat. The words came out in bursts interspersed with sobs, while I kept my eyes fixed on my own hands, unable to face the adults in the room. When I finished, the silence was so dense it seemed to have its own weight. The sheriff cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "We'll find him," he assured. "He won't escape." But he did escape, at least for a while. The following weeks were a blur of doctors, questions repeatedly exhausted, pitying looks that followed me everywhere. The news spread quickly, as happens in small towns. Whispers accompanied me in the school hallways, on the way to church, in the downtown stores. "That's the girl. They say the grandfather." Poor thing. I was no longer Clara, the spoiled girl, daughter of the railroad employee and the respected teacher. I was the victim, an object of morbid curiosity and superficial pity. At home, things also changed drastically. My parents, devastated by the guilt of not having noticed what was happening, converted this guilt into overprotection. I was never alone again. There was always someone with me: Mom, Dad, an aunt who came to spend time with us. The windows now had new locks, and Dad checked 2-3 times if all the doors were well closed before we went to bed. They moved me to their room. My old room, the one where the nightmare had happened so many times, was locked. No one entered there. It was as if that space had been contaminated forever. The nights were the worst. Even knowing I was safe, that he could no longer reach me, the nightmares came without fail. I would wake up screaming, soaked in cold sweat, feeling his weight on me, the smell of whiskey, the rough hands on my skin. Mom would hug me until I stopped shaking, murmuring words of comfort that couldn't reach the dark place where my fear lived. The police looked for Grandpa everywhere. He had disappeared like smoke. Some said he had returned to rural Kentucky, where he was born. Others that he had fled to Montana, where nobody knew him. There were even those who said he had killed himself, throwing himself into the river. I didn't believe any of those stories. In my childish and terrified heart, I was certain that he was nearby, watching me, waiting for the right moment to fulfill his threat. In April 1959, 2 months after the discovery, I began therapy. It was something rare at that time. A small town like Bakersfield barely had psychiatrists, let alone psychologists specialized in childhood trauma. But my parents moved mountains to find help. Mom even sold her jewelry to pay for the consultations in Los Angeles, where we traveled once a week. Dr. Helen was a middle-aged woman, with kind eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. Her office was welcoming, with soft armchairs and a shelf full of books and small toys. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," she told me in our first meeting. "We can just stay here in silence until you feel comfortable." That's what we did in the first sessions. I would sit, look out the window, sometimes pick up one of the toys, and manipulate it distractedly. She just observed, making occasional notes, never pressing me. "What happened to you was not your fault," she said one day, breaking our usual silence. "Nothing you did or didn't do caused this. The blame is entirely his." Those words, so simple and direct, hit me like lightning. I hadn't realized until then how much I blamed myself, for not having told before, for not having resisted more, for having believed his threats. "But I could have screamed," I murmured, tears flowing freely. "I could have told Mom on the first day if I had spoken." "You were a child facing something no child should face," Dr. Helen replied. "You did what you could to survive. And you survived. That shows you're stronger than you think." Strong? I didn't feel strong. I felt broken, dirty, irreparably damaged. "I'll never be like before," I confessed, giving voice to my greatest fear. "I'll never be normal." "Normal is a complicated word," she said, tilting her head thoughtfully. "You won't be as you were before, that's true. No one remains the same after trauma, but that doesn't mean you can't have a full, happy, and meaningful life." I wanted to believe her. I wanted so much to believe that there was a future for me beyond that horror, beyond the constant fear, beyond the sleepless nights and nightmares. May arrived, bringing heavy rains that seemed never to end. The sky remained constantly gray, as if reflecting the state of my soul. The police had practically given up finding Grandpa. The case was archived, although the sheriff guaranteed that he would be arrested if he ever reappeared. It was at this low point, when hope seemed more distant than ever, that Mom and Dad began to talk about moving. Leaving Bakersfield, starting over in another place where no one knew our story, where I wasn't the girl in the case. "Phoenix, maybe," Dad suggested during dinner. "I have a cousin who works at the post office there. He says he can arrange something for me." The idea of leaving the only town I knew, of abandoning the house where I had grown up, despite the terror of recent months, scared me almost as much as the possibility of staying. But what about school? And my friends? I asked, although I knew I had few friends now. Most had distanced themselves when the scandal came to light, out of embarrassment or by order of parents who didn't want their daughters involved. There are better schools in Phoenix, Mom replied, forcing an optimistic smile. And you'll make new friends. Friends who don't know, who won't look at you that way. I knew what she meant. The way everyone looked at me now, with pity, with morbid curiosity, or worse, with that uncomfortable expression of someone who doesn't know what to say. Perhaps, I thought, perhaps starting over somewhere else was exactly what I needed. A place where nobody knew, where I could just be Clara, not the victim. A place where every corner didn't bring terrible memories, where every shadow didn't make me imagine he was lurking. When? I asked. The first time in months I felt something like hope. Soon, Dad replied, squeezing my hand on the table. As soon as I confirm the job. A few weeks, maybe. That night, lying on the makeshift bed in my parents' room, looking at the ceiling while the rain hit the windows, I allowed myself to imagine this new beginning. A new house, a new school, new people who didn't know my past. Maybe there I could begin to rebuild the broken pieces of myself. Maybe there I could one day sleep without fear. But before we could realize this plan, before I could escape that town and the memories that haunted me in every corner, something happened that changed everything again. Something none of us could have predicted, and that would bring to light strengths I didn't know I possessed. It was in early June, almost 4 months after my parents discovered the abuse, that the storm that seemed to have passed returned with full force. And this time, I would be at the center of the hurricane, unable to hide, forced to face the monster of my nightmares one last time. It was a Saturday in June. A light rain was falling in Bakersfield. That sad rain that doesn't wash anything, just makes everything damper and heavier. I spent the morning helping Mom sort clothes for donation. We were preparing for the move, although we still didn't have a set date. Dad had gone downtown to resolve some pending matters at the bank. The two of us were alone at home. Doors and windows locked as always since that fateful day. The sound of the doorbell tore through the silence like thunder. Mom and I looked at each other, startled. We weren't expecting anyone. Friends and relatives knew they should notify us before visiting. It was part of the new security rules of the house. "Stay here," Mom instructed, her face suddenly tense. From the living room, I heard her cautiously approaching the door, asking who it was. The response was muffled by the rain, but I recognized the timbre of the voice. It was Mrs. Jenkins, our neighbor from across the street, a widow who had always been kind to me. Mom opened the door, but just a crack, keeping the security chain hooked. "Dorothy," I heard Mrs. Jenkins say, her voice unusually urgent. "I need to tell you something. It's about your father." My blood froze in my veins. Just the indirect mention of him was enough to leave me paralyzed with fear. "What about him?" My mother's voice sounded as sharp as a knife. "He's back." Mrs. Jenkins spoke so softly I almost didn't hear. "I saw him last night, walking on the back street. I'm sure it was him. He looked different. Long beard, thinner. But it was him." My legs gave way, and I leaned against the wall to keep from falling. He had returned. The monster of my nightmares was back, probably to fulfill his threat. "Are you absolutely sure?" Mom asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Absolutely," Mrs. Jenkins confirmed. "He didn't see me, it was dark, but I thought you should know. To be careful." I heard Mom thank her quickly and close the door. When she came back to the living room and saw me leaning against the wall, white as wax, she didn't need to ask if I had heard. My face said it all. "I'm going to call your father," she said, trying to appear calm, but I saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear I felt. Dad arrived home 20 minutes later, breathless from having run in the rain. His face was a mask of controlled fury. "I'm going to the sheriff's office right now," he announced, still standing in the entrance hall, dripping water on the floor. "They need to arrest him. He's been a fugitive for months. What if they don't do anything?" Mom asked, what we were all thinking. The police hadn't tried very hard to find him the first time. Why would it be different now? A tense conversation followed in the kitchen. Mom and Dad discussing in low voices, occasionally looking at me, sitting silently at the table. They talked about fleeing that same night, about staying with relatives in another city until everything was resolved, about hiring someone to protect the house. And then, in the middle of this anguished conversation, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, except for the occasional flashes of lightning that the storm, now stronger, hurled against the windows. An absolute silence fell over the three of us, as we realized our sudden vulnerability. "It's just the rain," Dad finally said, trying to sound confident. "I'll get the candles." As he went to the pantry to get candles and matches, Mom approached me, pulled up a chair, and sat beside me, holding my hand in the darkness. "Everything will be all right," she whispered, although her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. It was at that moment that we heard the noise, a light crack, as if someone was forcing the back door, the one that led to the yard, near the little room where Grandpa had lived. Dad came running back from the pantry, candles and matches forgotten. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. Before we could answer, another crack, stronger this time. Unmistakable. Someone was really trying to enter through the back door. "To the bedroom now," Dad ordered in an urgent whisper. "Lock yourselves in there. I'll see what it is." "No!" I exclaimed, grabbing his arm desperately. The idea of us separating, of Dad facing alone what could very well be Grandpa trying to invade the house, filled me with terror. Another crack, followed by the unmistakable sound of wood giving way. Whoever it was had managed to get in. At that moment, I realized we were cornered. The house had only two exits, the front door and the back door, the latter now compromised. To reach the front door, we would have to cross the entire living room, exposing ourselves. As if reading my thoughts, Dad pulled us to the kitchen cabinet, a narrow space where we kept brooms and cleaning products. "Stay here," he whispered. "Don't make any noise." Squeezed in that tight space, Mom hugged me tightly, muffling even the sound of our breathing. I heard Dad leave the kitchen, his light steps on the wooden floor that I knew so well. The following minutes were the longest of my life. Each second seemed to drag on as we tried to hear any sound from the house beyond the patter of rain on the roof and the occasional roar of thunder. Then voices, muffled at first, then louder. My father's voice, tense, furious, and another voice, which I recognized immediately, which made me tremble uncontrollably in my mother's arms. Him, Grandpa. The monster had really returned. I couldn't distinguish the exact words, just the tone. Accusations, denials, growing anger. The voices came from the living room, approaching the kitchen. "Your daughter is lying!" Grandpa's voice suddenly became clear, cutting through the air like a razor. "These girls nowadays make things up. They see on television and think." "Shut up," my father vociferated. "Get out of my house now, or I swear to God that this time I'll kill you." A sound of struggle, bodies colliding, something breaking. Mom squeezed me even tighter against her, her silent tears wetting my hair. "I won't leave without talking to that liar," Grandpa shouted. "She needs to confess that she made it all up. Look what you've done to me. You've turned me into a fugitive, a criminal." Another crash, the unmistakable sound of a body falling heavily to the floor. Mom couldn't take it anymore. She pushed open the cabinet door and went out, pulling me with her. The scene we found in the kitchen, illuminated only by the occasional lightning, would be etched in my memory forever. My father was lying near the table, a trickle of blood running from his forehead. Grandpa was standing, holding a broken bottle, obviously the weapon he had used against Dad. Seeing us, his face contorted into a smile that had nothing human about it. "There you are," he said, taking a step in our direction. "My ungrateful daughter and my lying granddaughter." He was almost unrecognizable. The white beard was now long and dirty, the eyes bloodshot, the wet clothes sticking to his thin body. He smelled of whiskey, sweat, and hatred. Fear paralyzed me, as so many times before. But something different happened then, something I didn't expect myself. An anger that I didn't know existed inside me, a fury accumulated over those months of terror and suffering, suddenly exploded, sweeping fear away. "I didn't lie," I shouted, my voice sounding strangely adult to my own ears. "You know what you did. You know." Grandpa seemed stunned for a moment, perhaps by my audacity, perhaps by seeing the terrified girl he knew transformed into someone who dared to confront him. That moment of hesitation was all Mom needed. With a quick movement, she grabbed the heavy iron skillet that was on the stove, and before Grandpa could react, hit him with all her strength on the side of his head. The impact was brutal. Grandpa staggered, dropping the broken bottle, and fell to his knees, dazed. Blood began to trickle from a cut above his ear. Dad was already getting up, staggering but determined. I saw in his eyes the same thing I felt in my heart. There would be no more fear, no more flight. That night, one way or another, the nightmare would end. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Grandpa, even injured, tried to get up, grabbing the edge of the table for support. His eyes, clouded by pain and alcohol, fixed on me with pure hatred. "You," he growled, trying to take a step in my direction. "You destroyed everything." Dad positioned himself between us, protecting me with his body. At the same time, Mom ran to the phone on the wall, which miraculously still worked despite the power outage, and dialed quickly. "Police!" she shouted into the phone. "Please, come quickly. Oak Street 247. He broke into our house. He's trying to attack our daughter." Grandpa, realizing he was cornered, made one last desperate attempt. In an unexpectedly agile movement for a man his age, he grabbed a knife from the sink and advanced against my father. Everything happened very quickly. My father dodged, trying to disarm Grandpa. There was a brief and violent struggle. I saw the knife blade reflect the light of a lightning bolt as the two men fought for its control. Then, a scream. The knife fell to the floor with a metallic tinkle. Grandpa backed away, holding his own arm, blood seeping between his fingers. At that moment, the lights came back on, flooding the kitchen with a sudden brightness that seemed almost supernatural after so much time in darkness. The scene froze like in a macabre photograph. My father panting, with blood on his forehead, my mother still holding the phone, eyes wide, Grandpa against the wall, wounded, and me standing in the middle of the kitchen, witnessing the end of a nightmare that had lasted too long. Sirens began to sound in the distance, approaching rapidly. Grandpa looked around, like a cornered animal looking for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go. The doors and windows he could use to escape were on the other side of the house, blocked by us. It was at this moment, with the sirens arriving and the inevitability of capture becoming clear, that I saw something break in his eyes. It wasn't regret or shame, nothing so human. It was just the understanding that he had lost, that there would be no more power over us, that his impunity had come to an end. "You don't know what you've done," he muttered, sliding down the wall until he sat on the floor, still holding his injured arm. "You don't know." Minutes later, the house was invaded by police officers. Grandpa was detained, handcuffed despite weak protests about his injury. I remember him looking at me one last time as they dragged him out. A look that no longer had the power to terrorize me, because now I knew something he didn't. I had survived. I had faced the monster and was still standing. The following hours were a whirlwind of activities: paramedics treating the cut on my father's forehead, police taking our statements, curious neighbors gathering on the sidewalk despite the rain, trying to understand what had happened. Sitting in the living room, wrapped in a blanket that someone had placed over my shoulders, I observed all that movement with a strange feeling of detachment. It was as if I were floating above the scene, seeing everything happen to someone else, not to me. It was only when everyone finally left, the police promising to return the next morning for more questions, the paramedics after ensuring that no one needed to go to the hospital, the neighbors reluctantly dispersed, that reality began to settle. We were the three of us in the living room, exhausted, still processing what had happened. A strange silence hung in the air, not the oppressive silence of fear that had been our constant companion for months, but a different silence, almost peaceful. "It's over," Dad finally said, his voice low but firm. "He won't hurt you anymore, Clara. Never again." For the first time in a long time, I truly believed those words. The nightmare had ended. Not in the way we expected, not as we had planned, but it had ended. That night, for the first time in months, I slept without having nightmares. A deep and restorative sleep that seemed to wash away a bit of the horror accumulated in my young soul. The next morning, when I woke up, a strange sensation invaded me. I took a few seconds to identify it, so unaccustomed was I to it. It was hope, a small flame of hope that, perhaps, life could be good again. Grandpa was formally charged and imprisoned. The trial, a few months later, was quick. The evidence was overwhelming, especially after he invaded our house, confirming all the accusations with his own actions. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. I never saw him again after that night in the kitchen. I never wanted to. I learned years later that he died in prison, a heart attack in the 5th year of his sentence. The news didn't bring me joy, but it didn't bring me sadness either. Just a strange emptiness, as if a particularly painful chapter of a book had finally been turned. Our move to Phoenix ended up happening anyway, a few months after the incident. We needed a fresh start, away from the memories, away from the looks, away from the whispers that persisted despite Grandpa's conviction. In Phoenix, gradually, we rebuilt our lives. I continued therapy with Dr. Helen, who helped me understand that what had happened didn't define me, that I was more, much more, than the violence I had suffered. Mom went back to teaching, now in a larger school where no one knew our past. Dad got a good job at the post office, thanks to the cousin he had mentioned. Little by little, life began to gain color again. It was a long and difficult road. There were relapses, moments when fear returned with full force, nights when nightmares returned as vivid as before. But each passing day, each small victory, making a new friend, managing to sleep an entire night without waking up screaming, being able to talk about what had happened without falling apart, was a step toward healing. At 17, I met Robert, a gentle and patient young man who would become my husband a few years later. He was the first person outside my family and therapy to whom I told what had happened. His reaction, compassion without pity, anger on my behalf without treating me as a victim, was an important part of my healing process. Life followed its course. I graduated as a teacher, like Mom. I married Robert at 23. We had 3 wonderful children, 2 boys and a girl. I knew the joy of being a mother, then a grandmother, and now a great-grandmother. I built a full, meaningful life, full of love and purpose. Today, at 79, looking back, I see that Dr. Helen was right. What happened to me didn't define me. It changed me, yes, how could it not? But it didn't determine who I would become. It was a horrible chapter in my story, not the entire story. I learned that healing doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it means remembering without the pain destroying you. It means carrying the scars, but not letting yourself be paralyzed by them. It means transforming your own pain into compassion for others, into strength to protect those you love, into wisdom to recognize both the darkness and the light that exists in all of us. And perhaps, most importantly, I learned that surviving is just the beginning. The true triumph is in living, fully, authentically, courageously, despite the wounds, despite the fears, despite the losses. That's why I'm telling this story today. Not to shock or cause pity, but so that perhaps some other girl, some other woman, some other person carrying invisible wounds knows they are not alone. That the darkness, however dense it may seem, doesn't last forever. That there is light on the other side, waiting for those who have the courage to keep walking. The verdict of that trial still echoes in my ears, as if it were yesterday. "Guilty," said the judge, striking the table with his gavel. Grandpa received 12 years in prison, but for me, no sentence would be enough to compensate for what he had done. Even knowing he was behind bars, the scars remained open in my soul. The day after the trial, Mom, Dad, and I had a serious conversation in our kitchen. The air was heavy, not just because of Grandpa's conviction, but because we all felt that something still wasn't resolved. Official justice had done its job, but there was a greater, deeper justice that remained pending. 12 years? Dad murmured, running his hand through his hair, already streaked with white strands. He can get out early for good behavior. And then, will we always live looking over our shoulder? Mom sighed, her eyes revealing the impossible weight she carried. The pain of knowing that her own father, the man who should protect her family, had destroyed her only daughter's innocence. "We need to do something definitive," she said, with a determination I had never seen before in her always gentle eyes. "Something that ensures he will never have the chance to harm Clara again." It was there, in that kitchen, that the plan began to take shape. Not a vengeful or violent plan. My parents were never people of violence. It was a plan of protection, of a fresh start, of rebuilding our lives in a way that man could never reach us again. "We'll leave Bakersfield," Dad announced. "Not just move to another city, but disappear. Remake our lives where he can never find us, even if one day he gets out of prison." Phoenix had been our initial plan, but now it seemed too obvious. It would be the first place he would look for us if he ever regained freedom. We needed something more radical, safer. "The Northwest," Mom suggested, surprising us. "My cousin Marjorie moved to Seattle years ago. She says it's another world, another life. No one would know us there." Seattle. The name sounded like an exotic promise of new beginnings. Almost 2,000 miles away from Bakersfield, separated not only by geography, but by landscapes, climates, and completely different cultures. "But what about jobs? Clara's school? Our house?" Dad questioned, the concern of providing for the family never leaving his mind. "We'll sell everything," Mom replied with surprising firmness. "We'll change our name if necessary. We'll do whatever is needed to protect our daughter." I observed my parents in that conversation, amazed by their determination, by the love they demonstrated for me. They were willing to give up everything, the security of established jobs, the house they had built with so much sacrifice, the proximity to friends and relatives, all to protect me, to give me a chance to start over. "What do you think, Clara?" Dad asked, finally turning to me. "Are you ready for a new beginning? To leave all this behind?" I looked around the kitchen, at the walls that had witnessed so many memories, some happy, others terrible. I thought about the school where everyone looked at me with pity or morbid curiosity. I thought about the streets of Bakersfield that now always seemed to hide shadows, each corner a reminder of what had happened. "Yes," I answered, feeling for the first time in many months something like enthusiasm. "I want to go. I want to start over." The preparations for our new life began discreetly, almost in secret. We didn't want anyone to know where we were going, not even the few relatives with whom we still maintained contact. Dad told only his boss, inventing a story about health problems that required treatment in another climate. We sold the house to a couple from Los Angeles who didn't even visit the property. They bought through a realtor, attracted by the below-market price we offered to accelerate the sale. The larger furniture was included in the sale. The rest was donated or sold in small lots, so as not to attract attention. Mom wrote to her cousin in Seattle, asking for help finding a house to rent and information about schools and possible jobs. The letters were sent to an intermediate address, the house of a trusted work colleague, to avoid any trail in case someone from Grandpa's family tried to locate us. In 2 months, everything was ready. We left Bakersfield at dawn on an October day in 1959, when the town was still asleep. A single taxi carrying 3 people and 6 suitcases, all that remained of our previous life. We went to Fresno, where we would take the train to San Francisco, and from there, a plane to Seattle. The journey was long and tiring. The plane, a novelty for me in another situation, would have been exciting, but I was too exhausted, too emotionally drained to feel anything beyond a vague relief that we were getting farther and farther away from Bakersfield. We arrived in Seattle on a cool, damp afternoon that made my clothes stick to my body instantly. Marjorie, Mom's cousin, was waiting for us at the small airport with a warm smile and tight hugs. She didn't know the details of what had happened. Mom had only told her that we had serious problems and needed to start over. But her hospitality without questions was exactly what we needed. The Seattle of 1959 was a fascinating city, so different from everything I knew that sometimes it seemed like we had traveled to another country, not just to another state. The vibrant colors, the intense smells of the sea and fresh fish, the constant cool temperatures, the rain that fell almost every day, the slower pace of life. Everything conspired to create the feeling that we had really left our past behind. We rented a small but airy house in the Wallingford neighborhood, not far from where Marjorie lived. Dad got a job in an import-export company, thanks to a contact Marjorie had. The job paid less than his old position at the railroad, but offered the possibility of growth. Mom, after a few weeks of searching, was hired as a substitute teacher at an elementary school. For me, the adaptation was more difficult. The school was completely different. People's accents, the slang I didn't know, the customs. Even the school lunch had flavors strange to my palate from the California interior. In the first weeks, I practically didn't speak to anyone, staying isolated in the corners of the schoolyard during breaks. But gradually, something curious began to happen. Away from the environment where everyone knew me as the girl in the case, I slowly relearned to be just Clara. No one there knew about my past. No one looked at me with that mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. It was a liberating anonymity. The first friendship I made was with Emily, a freckled girl with an easy smile who sat at the desk next to mine. She adopted me, so to speak, deciding that I needed to learn the local customs. "You talk so funny," she laughed, imitating my California accent. "Come on, I want to show you what a real salmon is, not that thing you Californians call salmon." With Emily, I discovered Pike Place Market, tried foods I didn't know existed, learned to ride the ferry across the Sound. Her company, so carefree and cheerful, was like a balm for my wounded spirit. At home, I also saw my parents changing, adapting. Dad abandoned the formal suits he always wore in Bakersfield, simply incompatible with Seattle's climate, and adopted light sweaters and casual pants. Mom let her hair grow and often wore it loose, something I had never seen her do before. Small changes that symbolized something bigger. We were allowing ourselves to be different people, leaving behind not only the horror of what had happened, but also the rigid versions of ourselves that existed before. Of course, not everything was easy. There were nights when I still woke up screaming, soaked in cold sweat, certain that I had heard Grandpa's voice in the hallway. Days when an older man on the street, with some physical resemblance to him, made me freeze in terror. Moments when the simple act of someone closing a door too hard made me panic. I continued therapy with a new psychologist, Dr. Margaret, to whom Mom told the whole truth so she could help me properly. It wasn't the same as the sessions with Dr. Helen in Los Angeles, but gradually we built a relationship of trust. "Trauma doesn't disappear just because you changed a dress," Dr. Margaret explained in one of our first sessions. "But you can learn to carry this story in a way that doesn't prevent you from living fully." And that's what we slowly began to do. Learn to carry our story in a new way. A year after our arrival in Seattle, Dad received a letter. It came from the lawyer who had handled the sale of our house in Bakersfield. It was short and direct. Grandpa had died in prison. A massive heart attack during lunch in the cafeteria. Dad and Mom discussed at length whether they should tell me. I ended up overhearing by chance, listening behind the door, a habit I had developed in Bakersfield and still hadn't completely abandoned. When I confronted them about what I had heard, Mom hugged me, tears in her eyes. "He can't hurt you anymore, my child," she said. "Never again." I didn't cry. I didn't feel relief or joy or sadness. It was as if the news was about a stranger, someone I barely knew. I realized that, in a certain sense, this was true. The man who had hurt me so deeply wasn't really my grandfather. He was a monster who wore his face. The true impact of the news came more slowly, in the days and weeks that followed. I realized that I no longer needed to constantly look over my shoulder, that we no longer needed to keep our location secret, that the fear that he might one day get out of prison and find us had finally dissipated. It was as if an enormous weight had been removed from our shoulders. Our new life in Seattle ceased to be an escape and became simply our life. In 1962, when I was 15, Dad was promoted to manager at the Import-Export Company. The salary increase allowed us to buy our own house, larger and airier, near Green Lake. Mom secured a permanent position as a teacher, and I, to everyone's surprise, including mine, became one of the best students in my class. "Look at that," Dad commented proudly when I showed him my report card full of high grades. "Who would have thought, huh? Our daughter, the intellectual of the family." At the new school, I made more friendships. I started participating in the drama club, discovering that acting, being someone else for a few hours, had a curious therapeutic effect on me. On stage, I ceased to be Clara, the girl with a painful past, and became whoever the role required. It was in the school theater that I met Thomas at 16. He was 2 years older, in his senior year, and played the lead role in the play where I had a supporting role. Tall, with dark hair and impressive blue eyes, Thomas was my first true love. Our relationship developed slowly. Different from other boys I knew, Thomas was never rushed or insistent. He seemed to intuitively understand my limits, my fears, although I had never told him about my past. Our first kiss happened after a particularly successful performance of the play. It was gentle, respectful, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of another person's touch. It was as if something frozen inside me finally began to thaw. Thomas and I dated for almost 2 years. He was my first boyfriend, my first experience of romantic love. With him, I learned that physical intimacy could be beautiful, respectful, based on mutual consent and affection, the complete opposite of the violence that had marked my introduction to sexuality. Eventually, Thomas won a scholarship to study engineering at Stanford. Our relationship didn't survive the distance, but we parted with affection and respect. He went his way, and I went mine, but I will always be grateful for the role he played in my healing journey. In 1966, at 19, I enrolled at the University of Washington to study English literature. It was there that I met Robert, a law student with gentle eyes and passionate ideas about social justice. He was from Portland, the son of a businessman and a teacher, and had come to Seattle specifically to study at the university. Our friendship began in a joint project between the literature and law departments, an initiative to bring basic education to underprivileged communities. We spent hours discussing materials, planning classes, occasionally arguing about pedagogical approaches. It was a friendship based on mutual respect and shared interests. The romance came almost a year later, naturally, as if it were the next logical step in a relationship that was already deep and meaningful. With Robert, I finally found the courage to share my entire story: the abuse, the escape, the fresh start in Seattle. He was the first person outside the family and therapeutic circle to whom I told everything. His reaction was exactly what I needed: indignation at what had happened to me, without treating me as a broken victim, compassion without pity, and, above all, an understanding that my past was part of me, but didn't define me. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he told me after hearing the whole story, holding my hands firmly. "And I love you exactly as you are, with all your scars and all your strength." We got married in 1970, when I was 23 and he was 25. It was a small but joyful ceremony at First Baptist Church near our new home. My parents, visibly moved, gave me away at the altar, both together, a break from tradition that made perfect sense for our family that had survived united through the worst of nightmares. The following years brought more healing, more joys, more milestones of a life that, against all odds, had become full and meaningful. Our first son, Paul, was born in 1972. Sarah came in 1975, and finally Mark in 1979. Having children was another important stage in my healing journey. Each pregnancy, each birth, was a way of reclaiming my body, of affirming that it was mine, not an object of violence, but a vessel of life, of love, of continuity. With each child, I felt more connected to my own humanity, more complete and whole. Motherhood also brought new challenges and fears. I found myself being overprotective, especially with Sarah. The terror that something similar could happen to my daughter sometimes woke me at night, in a cold sweat. It took a lot of internal work, and some additional therapy sessions, to find the balance between protecting my children and allowing them to live their own lives, free from the weight of my trauma. My parents were wonderful grandparents, present, loving, but always respecting our space as a family. Dad retired in 1980 and dedicated much of his time to his grandchildren, teaching them to fish, to fix things, to appreciate the small pleasures of life. Mom continued teaching until 1985, when she also retired and plunged headfirst into the life of a grandmother. Life continued its course, bringing joys and sorrows, as happens with all families. I lost my father in 1990 from a sudden heart attack, the same end that had taken his tormentor years before, an irony that didn't go unnoticed. Mom lived longer, passing away peacefully in 2003 at 84, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even some great-grandchildren. Robert and I remained together, building a life I never imagined possible in the dark days of 1958. He became a respected lawyer, specializing in human rights and social causes. I became a university professor, sharing my love for literature with generations of young people. Our children grew up, formed their own families. Paul became a doctor, Sarah followed in my footsteps and became a teacher, Mark chose engineering. Together, they gave me 7 wonderful grandchildren who are now beginning to present me with great-grandchildren. Today, at 79, looking back on this long journey, I clearly see how the desperate plan my parents conceived at that kitchen table in 1959 completely changed the course of our lives, not just taking me away from danger, but opening paths we would never have trodden if we had remained in Bakersfield. That decision to leave, to rebuild everything from scratch, was the most courageous and loving act my parents could have done for me. They sacrificed the safety of the known, risked everything for an uncertain future, just to give me the chance to heal, to grow, to live without the constant shadow of fear. Official justice did its part. It condemned the monster to prison, where he eventually met his end. But the true justice, the one that really mattered for our family, was the one we built with our own hands. The deliberate choice not to allow that violence to define the rest of our lives, the refusal to be forever victims, the determination to build something beautiful from the ruins. If there's a lesson this long life has taught me, and that I would like to share with you who are watching me, it's that our power of healing is much greater than we imagine. No matter how deep the wounds, how dark the night, there is always the possibility of dawn. There is always a path to reconstruction, to redemption, to joy. My dear viewers, who have watched me until now, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to this old lady tell her story. If my journey has touched your heart in any way, I ask that you leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Each subscription makes me feel that it was worth opening my heart, that my words may perhaps bring comfort or strength to someone who is going through their own valley of shadows. And if you want to hear more stories of overcoming like mine, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. On Grandparents' Tales, we share real stories of other grandparents who, like me, carry stories of pain, resistance, and triumph. Stories that remind us that we are much stronger than we imagine, that our scars, although they never completely disappear, can become marks of honor that tell not only what we suffered, but mainly how we survived. Until the next video, my dear ones, may God bless each of your paths, and may you never lose hope, even in the darkest nights. This grandmother here is living proof that there is always, always light at the end of the tunnel.